Good evening. My name is Jürgen Herre. I'm a vice chair of the AES Technical Council, and it is my pleasure to introduce the Richard C. Heyser Memorial Lecture Series. Well, the series was established in 1999 to honor Richard Heyser's extensive contributions to the society. The Heyser series is an endowment for lectures that brings eminent individuals in audio engineering and related fields to AES conventions. Along with this lecture series, awareness of Dick Heyser's work has been greatly helped by AES publication Time Delay Spectrometry. And this anthology is actually available as a free PDF download to all AES members. After Richard's death in 1987, his wife Amy and a group of engineers that were close to Richard formed the Richard Heyser Memorial Scholarship Fund. It is through generous donations from this fund that the AES is able to present this lecture series, and we would like to express our ongoing thanks for this financial support. You can learn more about the Heyser lecture series at the Technical Council section of AES.org. And now, without much further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce this time's Heyser lecture that is going to be given by Jamie Angus-Whiteoak. So please help me welcome Jamie.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming. I want to talk today about something we all use as part of our audio business, and that's our ears. And in particular, I want to link it to some of the things we do in signal processing in audio these days. When Richard did his seminal work on time delay spectrometry, it was really hard to do Fourier transforms by any means, and certainly quite difficult digitally because we didn't have the computer power or even the memory capacity to do it in real time. Nowadays, you can open your laptop or even your iPad, and I will guarantee there's probably some Fourier transforms doing some signal processing in the stuff that happens to you. And of course, the variations and versions of the Fourier transform are the foundational part of some of the means of audio delivery for streaming, films, etc. Now, we also know that our inner ear converts the sound waves that hit it into a frequency-dependent representation before it sends nerve impulses off to our brain. And however, that impulse, that representation is different from the Fourier transform. And what I want to do today is introduce you to the way in which the ear is different, and go maybe a little bit deeper than a lot of these talks and stuff in the book go into, including the nonlinear and dynamic behavior of the ear. And then I want very briefly, without any sums or maths, to examine the difference between the Fourier transform and the human auditory system and highlight how they trade off time and frequency resolution differently. And also look at how processing in the Fourier domain can result in artifacts, which I think we can perceive. Some people, there may be some arguments about that, and that's fine. And then right at the end, very briefly not quite right at the end, the penultimate discuss some ideas for how we might mitigate these effects in our processing. And finally, I'd like to float a little idea for you to think about. This is like the to be continued bit, and that's to look at how we could maybe look at the human auditory system as a form of compressed sensing, which is a buzzword that's around at the moment, but essentially shows that you can encode an incredible amount of detail in quite small amounts of actual data. Right, so the ear, the human ear. This is a classic picture of it. It consists of the bits we can see, the outer ear. There's an ear canal, we can stick fingers, don't stick anything else into it. And there's an eardrum, which if we're lucky, stays undamaged for most of our lives. If we're unlucky, can get damaged and hurts. Between the eardrum and the inner ear is 3 tiny little bones, the smallest bones in the human body, called the hamarhynchus and stapes. And they do an interesting thing we'll talk about later. And then finally, we have the inner ear, which is where the business happens of converting sound into nerve impulses that our brains then interpret as Zadok the priest, or the songs from Hamilton, or whatever, or even Heyser lecturer talks. So here's a sort of system diagram of the ear. So it doesn't actually look like that. And what I want to highlight, and we're going to go through these bits in turn, we've got the outer ear, which has an important actual function. Aside from protecting your eardrum, it also does some frequency shaping of the sound as it comes into your ear, which enhances our sensitivity, particularly at around 3 to 4 kilohertz, that region. And there's a little enhancement at 12 kilohertz as well. Then there's the eardrum, which is effectively our microphone diaphragm, followed by a cunning arrangement of bones that form an impedance transformation between air and water. If you stand on a cliff and clap your hands, you will get a slapback echo from the water. If we didn't have these 3 little bones, that's essentially what would happen to sound waves in our ear. Dolphins don't have them. They don't need them because they hear in water. But we need them so that we can actually transfer some energy from the air into the inner ear, the cochlea, which has all the nerves. We'll go into more detail in a minute, but also interestingly resonates in a rather actually doesn't resonate in a nonlinear way, but in a frequency-dependent manner that actually gives us our approximately logarithmic hearing scale. Let's go and look at these in a bit more detail. So firstly, the outer ear. So we could sort of think of this as a combination of over level protection and mechanical protection. So one of the main purposes of the ear canal is to stop sticks and things poking holes in our eardrums, right? It's buried just deep enough so that we can't accidentally damage it. So it's like it's a sort of different form of diaphragm cover, for want of a better name. But in order to do that, it has to have some length. Because it's got some length, it'll have resonances, and there's a lot of different things on that diagram that contribute to it. So the black line is the sort of total shape of it. And the real thing to notice is that it peaks up somewhere around 3 kilohertz, just a little under. But that consists of some resonances from the ear canal, which is the red line, which shows the main one and starts showing the higher one. There's some frequency shaping due to the fact our ears are sitting on the outside, and they actually disturb the sound a bit. I actually think one of the interesting bits is the orange line. And the where is it? The purple line. Because we've got this bit of meat sitting between our ears, actually sounds coming from this direction will actually be enhanced at certain frequencies compared to sounds on the other side. We'll get some head shading. But the really interesting thing, I think, is the torso and neck. You know, it's actually not just the ears that affect the frequency response. Actually, it's a whole body experience. So you don't know whether if you get bigger, you get more sound there or not. But obviously, your actual physical environment that's near you will affect the sound that end up arriving at your ears. So we've got a bit of EQ happening there. The middle ear. Now, this is actually quite an important bit. This is the bit that actually ensures that very low impedance acoustic wave can actually get transferred to water fairly maximally. And when you look at it, there's an area change. The eardrum's quite wide area. The little window in the Cochlear is quite small, so that gives you an impedance change. And then these, although they don't look like it, are essentially a series of levers which further increase the ability of the audio, the acoustic sound, to move the waves in water. And in fact, you can work out the gain. It's variable, as like everything, and it's frequency dependent, as you can see, but it gives us about 23 dBs worth of gain, which is quite a lot when you think about it, just by matching the impedances. So that's something that's quite good for us. And the overall effect of those two systems is pretty much what gives us these Fletcher-Munson curves of sine waves. You can see there, they've got a shape which, the two things of note is they've obviously got, they're not flat with frequency, but they are, they're a little bit more sensitive in the 3 to 4 kilohertz region. And the other thing to notice is that at low frequencies, the contours get close together. So at low levels, we don't hear bass so good. At high levels, we do hear the bass a lot better. And that compression, for want of a better term, of those thresholds is one of the reasons we like to listen to music loud. But it's also measuring the effect of a protective muscular response to the middle ear. So this is where the action happens. The inner ear is our transducer. It's not electrodynamic, it's not condenser, it's not even MEMS or laser interference. It wiggles a boundary. Essentially, in the inner ear, standing waves are set up, and it turns out they're approximately logarithmic. You can sort of see there. So the wave goes down and bounces off the end and comes back. And the high frequencies wiggle the basilar membrane close to the entry to the cochlea, whereas the really low frequencies get all the way down to the end and wiggle the end somewhere at the end. And then on the basilar membrane and around the basilar membrane, and we will look at that structure in a minute, there is a rather interesting set of structures that then convert that vibration of the basilar membrane into nerve impulses, which sound very exciting, sort of like that if you play them through loudspeakers. Information is then carried by the rate at which the pulses happen, but also their relative timing to each other, which is, if you think about it, a pretty crude conversion. I mean, it's estimated as one, I can't remember how many bits. It's more than 1 bit, but it's not many bits of conversion. So, and yet we get this richness of perception from it. Here's another picture of it, just to sort of show it off a bit better. There's 3 different frequencies, and they're approximately evenly spaced across the basilar membrane. So in terms of millimeters of distance, and you'll see, say, the D, the lowest frequency wrong. This is how it responds to sound. So very small sounds, very sensitive sounds around, what's that, 300 hertz. Whereas A, which is quite close to the entrance of the cochlea, is more responsive to sounds around 50, well, maybe 13 or so kilohertz. Now we're getting to the important bit, because the organ of Corti is the place where it happens, the place where it happens, the place where it happens. The organ of Corti is the place where it happens, the place where it happens, the place where it happens. Right, this is frankly amazing, okay? So the cochlea is basically filled with slight salty water. The basilar membrane vibrates, this fluid is displaced, and that displacement sets hair cells into motion, and that motion of the hair cells cause the nerve cells to fire. Those nerve spikes then go onto the brain, which then we interpret as well, sounds. And there are two types of hair cells. There are things called inner hair cells, one per position on the basilar membrane, and there are 3 outer hair cells per position on the basilar membrane, and they work in concert and they have different functions. The other thing I'd like to point out is the purple bit at the top here, this thing called the tectoral membrane. That sort of is almost like a base plate. The basilar membranes here, that wiggles up and down. This also wiggles up and down in sympathy, but they do it in a different way so that there's some net movement of the hair cells that sort of sit between the basilar membrane and the tectoral membrane. Here's the actual pictures of the two hair cells. I'm sorry, I realized they look very dodgy, actually. So the outer hair cells on the right, now they act as amplifiers, cochlear amplifiers. We'll see that in a minute. And the inner hair cell is the sensor. And you'll notice, and again, we'll talk a little bit about this later on, is there's one hair cell, but it's got those blue things stuck around it are the nerves that end up being triggered by it to fire. So I didn't actually know this. I thought there was one nerve per hair cell. You end up getting, there's lots of different hair cells. Some respond to louder sounds better than weaker sounds. And there's a little red bit there, which is feedback from the brain. The outer hair cells basically only have 2 inputs, basically feedback from the brain, and 1 output, which also goes back to the brain. And this is where you get a slight nature going over the top on you. In the human cochlear, there are about 3,500 inner hair cells and about 12,000 outer hair cells, all in a line. So, you can think of 1 plus 3 sitting ready to march, and then there's 3,500 of those in the line, and because they're spaced along the cochlear membrane, they're responding to different frequencies. And the point about this is that the inner hair cells sense the movement of the basilar membrane, and they generate nerve impulses. The outer hair cells convert tectoral membrane movement into basilar membrane movement. They do something very interesting. So here's a little animation of it that I found. You'll see as that basilar membrane vibrates up and down, it bends the hair cells which are attached to the tectoral membrane. And when those hair cells bend, it actually causes the outer hair cell to contract. All right? So we have an active mechanism going here. And that active mechanism, obviously, if it contracts, if the hair cell contracts, it's going to move the basilar membrane, which is then going to move the tectoral membrane, which is going to then contract again. So it amplifies the basilar membrane movement. In fact, if we go through the sequence, it's basically circular. But those of you that have done PA or have had the misfortune to hear someone push a PA into feedback, just before that horrible squeal happens, you get quite strong resonances and ringing in the system. Yeah? And that is the process that's happening in our ears. And most of the time it works quite well. But sometimes we get some squeals as well, which is not the only reason for, but one of the reasons for tinnitus. So it's a positive feedback mechanism. And I always like to put a bit of old technology in. This reminded me of old style receivers called regenerative radio receivers, which would have a knob on it called reaction, which essentially used the same idea. They generated positive feedback to make the receiver tune up things more accurately, and also it increased the sensitivity of the receiver. And it's like HAL round or feedback in PA systems or the regenerative receiver. And what we've got is essentially a positive feedback system. So we have 3,500 of those systems sitting in each ear. And what's the effect of that? Well, that's quite interesting. The effect is to sharpen the tuning. If we looked at ears, and in fact, the original research was done on ears from cadavers, and they observed the resonance of the basal membrane, but the selectivity was really very poor, far too wide to explain what we were able to do. This positive feedback sharpens up the tuning and increases the sensitivity. And I've got the example there where the blue line, that's what it would be like if there was no positive feedback. And you see it's pretty measly. Whereas if we look at the dotted red line, we can see two things. One is it's a lot bigger, up to 40 dB bigger. It increases the sensitivity by a huge amount, but it does decrease for large sounds. And the million-dollar question then is, well, if we're operating a system close to feedback, how do we stop it howling at us all the time? And that's where it really gets interesting. This looks also and the basic reason is there are paths. It's not all one way. It's not like a microphone. We have the green line is from the outer hair cells is sending information up to the brain. This is brain stuff. And the brain is sending control signals to the hair cell fibers. So there is control happening from the brain to the outer hair cells, and that control goes. There are actually some synapses on the way up. So there's some rapid turnaround feedback, but it goes all the way up to the higher auditory cortex. So there is a control element that comes from, our top level, our perception, and again, I think many of you may have experienced it, you start listening to something and then you concentrate and you actually start hearing things, in more detail. And that's almost certainly the higher order cortex is changing the way this feedback system works. So we've got send and return nerve fibers for the outer cells. So that means the brain can control the level of feedback for stability, which is obviously the first thing it's got to do. But also in conjunction with the inner hair cells, which also, although they primarily have there are lots of the blue ones which are sending stuff up to the brain, they still have a pathway back from the brain to do some control work. And I would suggest to you that the brain therefore can control, not necessarily consciously, the level of feedback, even probably in specific areas, and hence increase or decrease the cue as required and focus on specific sounds. And, if you want to think of evidence for that, why does ear training work? Ear training, people listen to things and get told what to listen, learn how to recognize it, and they get better at recognizing the different bits of sound. And even when we do threshold experiments on various aspects of hearing, one of the key things you've got to do is train your test team, your listening team, so they've got the maximum chances of listening to it. The net effect of all this is quite interesting. So this bit here is what you should measure if it was a completely passive system. But it's not. It's an active system. So at very high signal levels, actually, it can't do much because, like any active system, it's got a headroom problem. These overhair cells can only contract so much. So, if you're putting in big loud noises, the amount of positive feedback they can add to the system isn't as big. Whereas at lower levels, and you'll notice between the range of 40 to 80, which is pretty much where we live in terms of sound level, and that it's up to 40 odd dBs of, only varies by 10 dBs with a 40 dB change in dynamic range. So what's that? 4-to-1 compression, and then starts tailing off a bit towards the more normal 1-to-1 slope afterwards. So hang about, we've got equalization followed by a compression limiter. Sounds awfully like the first stage in a vocal chain for recording, doesn't it? But the positive feedback does decrease with level. And in terms of what it does to our bandwidths, again, This feedback sharpens things up, so at low signal levels, they're reasonably sharp, but as we go up in amplitude, you can see that the filters become less able to exclude low frequencies from their band. And that's why we get the upward spread of masking that we see in speech codecs, etc. It's also why you shouldn't put too much bass into things if you want voice intelligibility, because the loud, low frequency stuff is, especially on loud things, is going to really get in the way of your higher frequency tones. We basically have a 3,500 fairly narrow bandwidth filters that get wider and wider as we go up in frequency, sitting on each ear. But I thought it'd be nice to compare it with what it feels like musically. So at our peak sensitive area, these filter bandwidths, the equivalent rectangular bandwidths of them, are about 2 semitones wide, so about 1/6 of an octave. This is at the good level, not very loud. And yet, if we, as we go down, below about a kilohertz, they start progressively getting wider. So we end up at 3 semitones. That's a quarter of an octave. 4 semitones is a third of an octave, which is where we are there. And then at very low frequencies, we're getting to 5 or so semitones, which, it's getting towards half an octave. And it's quite often, if you try and play a chord at those really low frequencies, they don't sound very nice because actually we can't separate them out properly. Okay, so that's bandwidth versus frequency. Now, it's interesting to look at this in terms of time responses. And I think this is one of the big differences between the ear and the Fourier transform, because we can simultaneously resolve frequency in quite a lot of detail in the lower end of our audio range, whereas respond very quickly to temporal information at the higher frequencies. And if we have a snap, I don't know, a twig snap or these sorts of things, then this is the impulse response of a simulation of a human ear using gamma tone filters. And you can see at low frequencies, it starts there and takes a while to get up and goes down. But, it's at 500 hertz. The bandwidth there would be on the order of a quarter of an octave. So, we're talking a few tens of hertz bandwidth. On the other hand, at 7.5 kilohertz, two things to notice. One is it comes out sooner. The peak happens much earlier than the peak at low frequencies. So we actually sense it quicker. But also, its response is much faster as well. And at 7,500, our bandwidth will be several hundreds of hertz wide. So we have simultaneous good temporal resolution at high frequencies, which is great for the impulses. But at low frequencies, say below around 2,000 hertz or thereabouts, we've actually got really good ability to resolve individual harmonic components of waveforms. So there's a trade, the time temporal frequency actually trade-off still happens, but it happens in a helpful way because, its high frequencies are more usually associated with things like twig snaps, whereas low frequencies are more associated with tuned instruments, etc. So that's the first point I'd like to say before I go on to the next point, is that the ear is really good at doing a combination thing. It's great at doing very quick temporal responses because of its high frequency wide bandwidths, but it's also good at doing frequency selective analysis at the lower frequencies, which is where most of our pitched instruments live. Even though it's not quick, it still gives us good frequency ability and the ability to understand speech and things like that. Each hair cell, there's a level issue as well. The speech ear system responds to level in a nonlinear way because essentially takes this enormous dynamic range and handles it. Actually, so do our mobile phones. If you actually look at the change in level of a radio signal from next door to the cell tower to the edge of the cell boundary, the variation in signal is quite large. And they handle it. And interestingly, they use a similar technique to what the human hearing system uses. But each inner hair cell has several sensing transducer nerve fibers, but they have different sensitivities. And what they basically do is, depending on the sound, if it's, the example there is for curve C, right? So there we have a hair cell that on the normal range of things sort of goes, if there's no sound at all, it's sort of going, it's clicking away a little bit, but not much. But as the sound gets louder, once we get above 22 or so dB, the spikes, the rate of spikes increase, and it starts going until we get up to 80 odd dB, where it's going. And we have other sort of middle and lower fibers. The most sensitive fiber, you'll notice, it actually responds almost immediately from threshold to by saying something's happening, but it sort of runs out of steam at about 20 dBs above threshold. And intermediate fibers, but of course the penalty for that is it's got a lot more noise. And as you go up in the intermediate fibers, again, have an intermediate resting pulse, average pulse rate. It's all sounds like random spiky noise, and goes up and starts running out of steam at about 40 dBs. And the three overlap like that. The different fibers work together to give us our wide dynamic range. And in fact, the front end of your mobile phones use a very similar technique of different amplifiers with different gains that actually, again, work together to give a wide dynamic range. It's kind of interesting. So that's the ear. The ear has nonlinear amplitude response within each band, which doesn't cause distortion because it's basically based on looking at band-limited signals, but it also has an active mechanism that enhances the cue, narrows the bandwidths of our auditory filters, and so long as that active system's working, unfortunately, it can be made not to work by having ototoxic chemicals or exposure to loud noises for any length of time, and other illnesses. But so long as that system's working, what we get is this amazing system that gives us more sensitivity, up to 40 dBs of extra sensitivity to sound, while, if you like, controlling the input levels and these narrow bandwidths. So, the discrete Fourier transform, right? I'm not going to talk about how it works, but essentially what it does is it takes samples in time and converts a block of samples in time into a block of frequencies basically associated with some time usually taken to be the middle of the block of samples that you're working on. Ish. It depends on exactly how you implemented it. So, we're taking time and flipping it via some mathematics into a sample of the frequency thing of that time. Fast processing algorithms mean they're actually ideal for workstation use and workstation processing. And there's a direct inverse relationship between the block size and the bandwidth. And this is almost philosophical. If I said to you, how long would you have to look at a signal to tell the difference whether it was 100 hertz, well, so let's say 1 kilohertz and 1001 hertz. So 1000 hertz, 1001 hertz. So they're wiggling along. They wouldn't really change much until you looked at it for about a second. And you can't really get out of that because you need to look at a signal for a certain length of time to be able to differentiate between, those two frequencies. So there is a relationship between the amount of time of signal you look at, and the actual frequency resolution you get. And it's the thing about the Fourier transform, it's the same for every frequency. So if you've got a 10 millisecond long block of data, I'm not going to worry, try and calculate how many samples that is. Choose your favorite sample rate and do the calculation yourself. And then you're going to have a frequency resolution of 100 hertz. And that every single frequency that your transform has extracted will have that bandwidth. So it'll be 100 hertz at the from the 0 to 100 hertz band, and it will be 100 hertz at the top end of the frequency range as well. Identical all the way across. So very unlike our ear. It has constant bandwidths. And here's a sort of a little picture of how the bandwidth's affected. So if you've got 150 hertz bandwidth, you're going to have a signal, a Fourier transform that extends over some period of time, because it's got to look at 1 over 100, 150 hertz, 6 or so milliseconds, or 8-ish milliseconds to resolve that. Whereas at 1200 hertz, it only needs a little bit over a millisecond or so, less than a millisecond to do it. So you can have good frequency resolution and poor time resolution, or you can have great time resolution but poor frequency resolution. You can't have both at the same time. Very much like an uncertainty principle, or I like to think of it, if you take a time-exposed photograph of cars driving around at night, then, a short one, you'll get lines where the cars are, and you'd be able to work out the velocity of those cars quite accurately, but you wouldn't know where they were. On the other hand, if you're in a disco and you're dancing away and they've got the strobe on, you know that person's hand was there when the light flashed. But in between that and the next light flash, you didn't know it was moving in the direction that would hit you. So you knew exactly where it was, but you didn't know its velocity or direction of velocity. And here's an example of that. This is a speech spectrogram. I do not know what the thing's saying, but it's got high and low frequencies components. And you can see the top one is what we call a broadband spectrogram. So these things probably have bandwidths on the order of 200 hertz. And you can see there the resonances are quite broad. You can't see any harmonic components, but you can see the little pulses. You see it gets black in little vertical stripes, which correspond to the peaks in the waveform in time. So it's got really great time resolution, but not so great in terms of pulse frequency resolution. On the other hand, the one below, which has probably got a bandwidth on the order of 20 or so hertz, we're seeing all the harmonic components there. We can see the narrow resonances, but we'll notice we don't see the peaks in the signal, and we also notice that the starts and ends of these ch sounds are sort of really not very well defined. So we've got great frequency resolution, but poor time resolution. In practice, to define I'm just throwing this out because I'm going to use the word. We'll use something called a window that says, that defines the length of the block we're using. And we don't usually just chop it out like a big square chunk and then do the Fourier transform. We start at the bottom, we fade up the signal, and then we fade it down again. And there's a variety of windows which look like brontosauruses. They're thin at one end, much, much thicker at the other, and thin at the other end again. So, what's the problem with using the Fourier transform? Well, the problem is it's great for linear stuff. So for doing equalization, convolution, filtering, that's what it's designed to do. And it's actually not really that much of a problem if it's static. If you set the equalization for a particular value and you're running the song through it and you're not changing anything, then it's great. It doesn't actually matter how long it is. it's fine. But if you do anything nonlinear or change gain within the transform, this would happen in a coding system where you quantize a coefficient. So you effectively alter the level of a Fourier coefficient or an analogous coefficient. You'll actually end up producing an output, which is the one on the left, which consists of an in component and a subtracted error, which is another component. Now, if both are together for the whole length of the transform, again, you probably wouldn't notice it. But if it's a time-varying thing and it only varies a little bit within the transform, there's a chance that that error will become unmasked and invisible, and you'll get a little ping. And I have actually heard those on coding systems. But the same thing can happen with dynamically varying gain systems like noise reduction or multiband compression. One of the things certainly in some of the early noise reduction systems that I heard, which were pulling down individual bands to get rid of noise, you heard this sort of in the background, and it was kind of disturbing. I actually preferred the frying bacon noise of the unprocessed audio, because it was a bit more comfortable, because it was this like, what is this, a swamp thing coming up? Right. So the other thing, which is a little bit more subtle, but when people design filters, they go to the MATLAB package and they use the filter thing, and it uses the XYZ package, which was designed in the 60s. And they design equiripple filters because that's what electronic engineers that do communications like. And this is, all right, this is a particularly bad example that shows things off well. But equiripple filters look nice to an engineer, but they have an interesting issue. And the interesting issue is that in order to get that lovely equiripple stop band, you've got the normal peak at the middle, and that's all right. This peaks and it starts decaying, but then it starts suddenly going back up again, and you get this little extra peak at the bottom. And on the linear scale, that doesn't look too bad, but when we put it on a log scale, actually it looks pretty bad. This is where I want you to play. Now, this may not work, but I want you to listen to the drums. And the first half of this thing actually doesn't have the little humps at the beginning and the end. It's particularly the hump at the beginning, the pre-echo. The second half does. And what you should hear is something funny happening before each bass drum beat in the second half. And we'll see how that works. Thank you for that. I don't know if people heard that or not. Shall we run it again so you can have another hear? It's a little, there's a little something. So some of you might have heard it, some of you might have not. I mean, the room is quite reverberant, so it's a little bit tricky. In a smaller room earlier, it did sound a lot more obvious. The thing I want to make, I'm making a point to all the audio DSP designers here, is do not use equiripple filters, all right? Because if you do the sums, if you do the maths, then you are guaranteed that if the filter has an equiripple stop band, it will have a little peak at the beginning and end of the impulse response. And you can't get around that. That's inherent in what's required of an impulse response for an equiripple design. Even a rectangular window would be better as far as pre-echo is concerned. Or even the hated Hamming. I mean, I hate the Hamming window because it was designed for radar, not audio. But if you pick a normal window function that is thin at one end, much, much thicker in the middle and thin at the other, then actually you will get a filter whose impulse response just decays down into zero all the time. And it's probably going to sound better. So, to solutions. Do not use equiripple filter designs. Windows might be better. I'm not saying, but there might be other ways of doing it. Do not, and the other thing I think is, again, there's nothing wrong with using the DFT, the discrete Fourier transform, for processing. Don't just use it without thinking. If you're doing something linear, use it. It's not going to hurt you. But if you're doing anything that's time varying or non-linear, chances are it's not going to do as well as you thought it would do, because your ears hear differently to how the Fourier transform, and you'll get artifacts that your ears can sense caused by the DFT process. So sample rate changing, I know, I'm sorry, I'm just going to say query on that, but you need to take effects. And one of the things I'd like to say is you can use the DFT for these nonlinear things, but you have to use it intelligently. And that means that when you do stuff at high frequencies, you use locked bands, multiple FFT, DFT coefficients together so that you operate all of them together, and you effectively are mimicking the wider bandwidth of your hearing system with a good time response. To make that actually happen, you're going to have to use a shorter window at the higher frequencies compared to the lower frequencies, which brings in its own little problem. It will cost you more computation because you're going to have to overlap the discrete Fourier transforms more. I mean, in theory, you could just overlap. Because you have to do it as a whole block, you can't have half a block. Then you'll end up finding you're overlapping them quite a lot to handle the shorter windows at high frequencies. And there are a couple of other things that you need to get right, including when the windows summing to unity so you don't get noise from the overlapping window systems. And the final bit. So I actually think, this is me floating an idea, I actually think the human ear is a compressive sensing system that has been genetically optimized, is that like that's the right term, evolution, over thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, actually probably millions of years, because it comes from the mammalian auditory system, to be as good as it can be. And one of the key things for compressive sensing systems is to avoid regular sampling, because regular sampling gives you correlated alias components. You randomly sample things. And when you look at how that front end works, you'll get the input waveform going in, you'll get single fibers will fly, but when you put them all together, they're all sampling the signal at slightly different instances in a quasi-random fashion. They're preserving the phase of the signal because they're only doing it on the half wave, so you're getting phase information there, you're getting random sampling, non-uniform and quasi-rambling, random, and you can actually see structure in the average nerve firings, like a half-wave rectified version of the gamma tone impulse response. And neural processing is very similar to the sort of optimizations the compressive sampling people do to reconstruct their signal. So, and I think the guitar amp people, was it Cortex, that were talking in the keynote yesterday, they were doing random sampling of their parameter space, and it worked better than trying to do a grid. And I think that's because they're essentially having to do sparse sampling of their parameter space. You can't just use 11 all the time. So we can perhaps consider the ear to be a form of compressed sensing, and that would be quite an interesting idea. It's, even with the fact we get phase locking, which helps us with pitch detection, it's still non-uniform and quasi-random. So conclusions, the ear is amazing, full stop. And that gives us simultaneous excellent response to both frequency and time. It's adaptive and controlled by the brain. And I think that's very important. We can focus on sounds and concentrate. That's not static behavior. The DFT, however, is actually limited by its uniform bandwidths. That's its problem. And there are solutions that still let you use the DFT if you want. And finally, just as an idea to go away and think about, the ear might be the front end for a compressive sensing system. Right, and there we have it. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Wonderful, Jamie. Do you have any suggestions for processing algorithms, compression, expansion, equalization that would get us past these blocks and be more effective for the
I think
ear?
that depends on whether you're doing, I mean, Bob, I think it depends. If you're doing multi-band stuff, then I really think you should be doing it. I mean, and this is just an opinion. I mean, I haven't had any chance to back things up, but my sort of feeling, for want of a better term, is that we should be using, at high frequencies, we should be using bandwidth similar to what our ears are doing, and at low frequencies, we should be similar to what bandwidths our ears are doing. There are going to be artifacts, because those are, time-varying processes are nonlinear, but the likelihood is that those artifacts are going to fit in with the limitations of our hearing system in terms of hearing those artifacts. If we do it on straight Fourier transform, then we'll be either doing it too quickly at low frequencies and too slowly at high frequencies. You know, we can't get it right. If we're just talking wideband compression and things like that, that's a whole different ball game. That's to do with the temporal side of things, and that's as much to do with what's the waveform actually doing between the samples. And for that, it's not online yet, but can I recommend the lecture I gave to the UK section called True Peaks? The samples are not always what they seem, which hopefully will go on the UK section website soon.
Your thing about how the ear responds with pulses to the incoming signal reminded me of a point that came up this morning, which is, does the ear even really care about the shape of the waveform, or is it just responding to the edges and the frequency content? I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
It has been, there was a model of hearing that said the ear only responded to energy within the bands that it selected. There is some experimental evidence that's not the case. And the actual neural transduction system is highly nonlinear. It only picks basically the one half of the waveform. So the minute you do that, you've got a time and phase reference. Because, you know, if it was just doing mean square error, yeah, it would just be energy. But it's not. It's actually sending off. You know, you're getting half cycles going into the cortex. And I cannot believe that a very large, deep learning neural network, which I suppose much bigger than any of you guys can even conceive of building at the moment, can't unravel that and then get some time efforts. And some of the pitch sensing and experiments and things that people do seem to indicate there's definitely some level of timing. The fact that we can hear interaural time delay is another example that there is some timing stuff going in there. Because if there wasn't any timing stuff, how would we know that it was over there at 300 hertz? You know, so I guess the answer is yes. It may not be as dominant as the energy in each band, but it's still there and being used as part of the mix, which is why I said if it was a compressed sensing system, it would essentially be recovering all the information from the signal. By the way, just as a side, compressed sensing recognizes that every real signal we deal with is actually redundant in some way or other, and you don't need to sample it entirely to get all the information. I mean, you've all got your modern iPhones with your God knows how many megabit sensors. I'm willing to bet the pictures that come out are still 2.4 megabits big. Because with the lenses you're using and the pictures you're taking, there isn't any more information in there. So you're creating all this data to then basically throw it all away because it's redundant. Who knew?
This may be my ignorance, but I think it's a fair question anyway. When you were showing the auditory filters.
Sorry, I can't actually.
When you were showing the auditory filters,
Yeah.
and the fact that if you model them, whether it's a gamma tone or something like what Luigi did, you get the same kind of thing where you see the onset of the filter starting earlier at higher frequencies and later at lower frequencies. Does that really translate into, by the time it gets up to the cortex and in the auditory cortex, and you're hearing the signal, do you actively hear the high frequencies earlier?
I think. I mean, I don't see why it should. I mean, there is definitely a time skew. I mean, there's the bandwidth time skew, but also, if you think about it, the basilar membrane close to, I mean, okay, the speed through the liquid's like going to be 1,000 feet a second or something like that, but it's going to be starting wiggling sooner, the closest bit to the later bit, and you're going to get a time skew. Now, I would agree with you, for a lot of things, the neural network, or whatever you want to call it, that's doing the interpretation, is going to just take that into account and say, well, that's what we recognize. But it's still picking up the high frequencies earlier. And I do wonder if some of our, things like pre-masking, which is like, why would that happen? It could be a cognitive effect due to higher order processing, or it could also be mediated by the fact that some bands actually get to the brain sooner than other bands. So if you have a weak sound in front and then an impulse following very quickly afterwards, then that impulse might get to the brain, at the same time as or before the earlier, maybe lower frequency sound or whatever. So I think that was the question you were asking. But
an impulse is actually a good example of what I'm thinking about, because if it's very wideband. So technically what you're saying is that the high frequencies are heard earlier than the low frequencies. They do actually arrive at the individual auditory filters almost simultaneously, because the transmission down the fluid in the basilar membrane is so quick. But if they're transmitted as impulses to the auditory nerve in a timing sequence that puts the high frequencies first, yet when you actually hear an impulse, you hear it as a very uniform time.
Yeah, you don't hear it smeared out.
You're not
I
hearing
think that's
the high
because your
frequencies
recognition system is basically picking it up. Is compensating for those delays.
Yeah.
But that I'm not even sure how you do an experiment to find this out. But it would be interesting to do something like send in high frequency filters and see if the response was faster. Maybe although your perception is a click, if you did some sort of reflex response and had high frequency signals and low frequency signals, you actually found there was a delay in the reflex response. So, so this is a case of where the system's got the information and it may do the startle response quickly, which would make sense for high frequency signals. But your perceptual response says that's a click, because it puts it all together and says those are all related to each other. And those would be two different responses, but you'd have to somehow manage to find an experiment that separated out those two systems. I think psychologists do that. Whether it's ethical or not, I don't know.
I would like to comment about your ideas about the compressed sensing.
Yes.
And the sampling at the spiking level. I believe it's true. The eye does the same. It does non-periodic sampling.
Yes, the eye is
in the spatial domain.
The eye chops data down brutally before it goes to the eye.
And the trade-off is between aliasing and noise. So when you go to non-periodic sampling, non-uniform sampling, you get rid of aliasing that you would have had otherwise with periodic sampling.
Yes.
And you get a bit of noise. And I got some data to show it in temporal sampling with the ear to basically support your idea.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting.
Well, thank you. It's nice to hear the same ideas from you.
I learned a new thing is that the brain has a feedback to the ear cell. So the
Yeah,
brain has
I
a
mean, not a
control line.
signal, not a signal feedback, a control feedback.
Control feedback.
Yeah, I mean, the actual, okay, so, I mean, in terms of real-time audio frequency signals, that's clearly happening within the cochlea, and we've got evidence for that, because if you stick a probe into the cochlear fluid, you will actually see pretty near a good copy of the audio waveform electrically in the cochlea. It's quite amazing. And that's because all these little OHCs are going tweak, 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 you know, in synchrony with the movement of the membrane and generating electricity, because that's how these systems work.
But the question is, if you have the disease called tinnitus,
Yes.
somebody told me a doctor could measure the frequency. Is that right, or is that wrong?
I think some tinnitus, all right, from what I've read, and I'm not medical expert, some tinnitus is disruption of that system, but not all tinnitus is. So I think it's one of those, it depends. You know, tinnitus is actually multifactorial or something. So some of the tinnitus is failures in that system, but other tinnitus, unfortunately, isn't. I mean, and some of it is isn't even generated in the ear, which is a real.
But the question is it really a resonance in the middle ear, in the inner ear?
Sorry, I didn't.
The tinnitus, the frequency.
The frequency.
You can measure that with a microphone?
Oh, yes. I mean, some tinnitus does give ototox, you know, actually generates sound on the ear, and you stick a microphone in the ear canal and hear it. Yep. Yeah. Otoacoustic emissions. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The question is, in natural sound,
Yeah.
the harmonics and the fundamental are in phase and tracking and so on and so forth. If you put that through a loudspeaker that has non-minimum phase characteristics,
Yes.
then they get disturbed, and it's a bit harder for the brain to sort that out.
Yes, I would. I mean, and I know certainly when I did speech research at Standard Telecoms, we actually tried to avoid speakers that had a crossover in the main speech range, because we got odd results from our listening teams. It was difficult to do. Right.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Right,
Let's
thank
give
you. Thank you for
Big
letting me do it.
applause to Jamie. And now it's my special pleasure to hand to you, Jamie, this award, but not so quickly. May I ask Raphael and Ville to join me on stage for helping me to hand over this certificate to you, which certifies you as a distinguished Heyser Memorial Lecturer.
Right. I think, can't you come on the other side of me? You know, I won't bite you. Honest.
Time for applause. Smile and photos. That closes our distinguished Richard C. Heyser Memorial Lecture for this convention. Thank you for being here. Thank you for all. And have a wonderful evening.
Can I just say thank you all for all the years I've had with you. You know, you've been my gang.